evening, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of this beautiful evening to be here. And thanks to all those who are joining us online tonight. My name is Irene Lane. I serve as the mayor of the town of Chevy Chase. And what I thought I would do tonight, we're obviously here to hear from Councilmember Friedson, but what I thought I'd do is start out with just kind of a level set of what's gone on in the last 6 to 7 years as it relates to this topic. And that way we can bring it over to more housing now. So about 7 years ago, there were discussions brewing concerning Thrive Montgomery 2050. And for those who may not know, it was kind of a plan for envisioning what the county should be and should look like by the year 2050. So there were a lot of like best in class recommendations about, the best parks and standards of living and things like that. But one of the things that a lot of different people focused on was density, increasing density throughout the county as it relates to housing units. So during those discussions, there were council member Jawando, who is now Council Vice President Jawando, introduced a ZTA that effectively focused on the metro areas to increase housing density around that. ZTA, thank you, zoning text amendment. So it's basically the legal language around how we can use this land. For what purpose do we use that land for? And alongside that, former council member Reamer introduced another ZTA that talked about increasing density along growth corridors. At that point, Councilmember Friedson said, hold on, let's wait a second here. We haven't even talked about Thrive Montgomery 2050. Let's at least agree in principle about what we want the county to look like in the future, and then we can go back to determine what ZTAs work. Thrive Montgomery 2050 was passed, and then the county council turned around and asked the planning department to come up with a set of recommendations, kind of a la carte options menu, things like that for, okay, now that we have Thrive Montgomery 2050, what does that look like in terms of residential housing? So the planning department came up with a long list of recommendations on how land could be used to increase not only residential housing, but also just kind of allowing more uses, commercial retail and other items like that. It then went to the planning board, who then greatly expanded on those recommendations, greatly expanded on those. At that point, Council President Friedson at that point said, look, we need to go around as a council and understand through listening sessions what residents are actually responding to, what's working, what's not working in terms of these recommendations. Out of all of those listening sessions, Council President, were you present at the time? I don't remember when it was introduced. No.
It just ended.
Ended, okay. Along with Councilmember Natalie Fanny Gonzalez, co-sponsored More Housing Now. So I'm going to turn it over. I don't know if that helps. That was like 7 years.
Thank you for the background.
7 years of like, so a lot of people had questions. A lot of people there was a lot of confusion, a lot of angst around it. Because by the way, it was all in the middle of the pandemic. And now we're facing, obviously there's some changes occurring at the federal government level. So all of this is happening at once. And we're just trying to make sure that everyone is understanding what's included in this, how it's different from all these other proposals, and get your questions answered. So with that, I will throw it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm Andrew Friedson. It's great to be here. Great to be back. I grew up playing basketball here, playing Montgomery County rec basketball, and my mom went to junior high school here, actually. So, the world turns and we end up in similar places where we started. The couple other aspects that I would just share to add on to what was shared by the mayor, and I appreciate you inviting me and all of your work and efforts. The housing concepts that ultimately were approved in Thrive actually predated Thrive and predated 7 years ago, well before I was even on the council. There was a housing element, which was an update to the previous master plan and general plan for the county which was called the housing element. It was in 2011, it was approved, and it essentially promoted a greater diversity of housing types within proximity to jobs and amenities and transit. And so that really was the predicate for what ultimately became the housing chapter of Thrive, and has been, effectively the, long-standing policy of the county when it comes to housing. Now, what that means, how to do that, how do you define that, that's where the rub comes, and certainly there's conversations to be had on that. Before I get into this, I did just want to acknowledge and mention that my Chief of Staff, Cindy Gibson, is here in the back, so anything that I get wrong or mistake or misstate, she will be here to correct me, which I appreciate, and please feel free to follow up with me or with her after tonight's conversation. But I'll just a quick overview of the elements of what we have introduced and where we are, and then I really want to focus mostly on your questions. I imagine if you're here or if you're tuned in on a Monday evening during, and right after Passover, heading into Easter, during the public school spring break, and everything else that's going on in your lives that you probably already know quite a bit, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but ultimately you heard the history. I won't go into that. The proposal that we have has 5 elements in it. You've heard about one main one, and I think the focus of tonight's conversation will probably be on the quarters zoning text amendment. That's one element of it. There's an office conversion element to it, which includes zoning changes to make it easier to turn vacant office into housing. We have about double, and maybe even a little bit more than double of the amount of office vacancy that is healthy for an area based on most traditional standards. That's not unique to us necessarily. That is a challenge facing every other regional jurisdiction. Most places around the country, the office market is very much significantly challenged at the moment. Those vacant properties are a scourge on our communities. We've been talking about that for quite a long time, and actually during the conversations related to attainable housing strategies, we heard from a lot of residents say, well, what about all these vacant properties? Why don't you do something about that? Why aren't you doing that? And it turns out we actually were doing that. I was actually focused on the zoning aspect of it as chair of the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee, which oversees zoning. The Economic Development Committee that Natalie Fani-Gonzalez chairs was mostly focused on the incentive piece of that. At the time, really focused on grant dollars or funding, less on tax abatements, which ultimately ended up what we ended up doing. And because we were both working on it, because this consistently came up as part of these conversations, we included it as part of this package, because it was very much one of the first, well, what about this and why aren't you doing it, and what is the plan related to that. That part of the plan has passed and was approved. It was a 10-to-1 vote on the incentive piece, which is a tax abatement for eligible conversions, and the zoning piece was approved 11-0 last week. So that part has been approved. There are the zoning piece. We've had one committee session on it, which we had a couple weeks ago. We went through a variety of questions and concerns and issues and outstanding dynamics that have come up, some of which overlap with the municipal letter that Irene and others have been involved in drafting, and I have had multiple conversations about. We'll come back to the zoning text amendment in June in committee after we get through the budget. So just to give you a sense of kind of the timing and where things are with that. And then there's a couple budget elements to it that we're still working through as part of the budget that we're taking up now that will be approved shortly before Memorial Day. And that's workforce housing fund and pathways to homeownership, of expanding the existing programs that we have for first-time homebuyers that I have worked on expanding previously, and we want to expand further because it's such an important part of building generational wealth and such an important part of providing home ownership opportunities for our residents. So that's essentially where we are, why we move forward with the approach that we did specifically related to the housing and zoning piece. It's a much more targeted approach. It impacts about just under 2,500 properties out of about 180,000 single-family residential lots in Montgomery County, over 200,000 residential lots in total. It's a much more focused, much more targeted approach. It's much more limited in terms of what you can do, and there's a much more prescribed process of what you have to go through. The bulk of the planning recommendations were predicated on it being by right, meaning you could build it like you could a tear down of a single family home, that you could tear a single family home down and you could replace it with either a much larger single family home, which is not overwhelmingly common, but happens frequently, particularly in our part of the county, and you could replace it with certain units up to certain standards. We've taken a different approach and limited what you can do and how you can do it, but also haven't done nothing by right. So now everything has to go through a regulatory review process, what's called optional method. It allows for public benefits to be obtained. It allows for a more formal community input process. It's a much more expensive, time-consuming, and rigorous process. It's more akin to one of the large multifamily buildings in downtown Bethesda than a tear down where you just have to pull a permit from Department of Permitting Services. So a much more significant one. We've also capped the heights to 40 feet. 40 feet is 5 feet taller than a single family home can be built at today. So it's much more restrained in that way. We've limited the density, meaning the amount of units that can be built at 1.25 FAR, which is floor area ratio, but that essentially limits the amount of units that can be built. We've retained the residential requirements. If you're building a duplex under this approach, you are held to the exact same standards as a single-family home currently is. If you're building more than a duplex, you're held to the exact same standards in terms of setbacks and lot coverage, et cetera, of the lowest intensity townhome requirements, still capped at that 40 feet. And in fact, many townhome standards within the zoning code allow for up to 45 feet is a fairly common townhome, but we're not allowing that level of height with these. The optional method also allows for us to require workforce housing. And so we have required 15% workforce housing standard as part of this effort. If you're building 3 or more units, a minimum of 1 of those units. So that wouldn't be possible, wasn't part of any of the previous proposals, including the zoning text amendment that was mentioned previously. That is part of this proposal and part of our discussion. It is, as I mentioned, it's much more targeted than what was originally discussed or contemplated. But it's a significant proposal that we put forward. I think it is meaningful and will make a dent in some of the challenges that we face. And we're working through many of the issues, and I really do appreciate the thoughtfulness of the letter that we received, that we have gone through a number of those issues that overlap with the committee conversation that we had, and we're part of that discussion. So I don't want to go into too much. I could sit here and talk for a while about all the various elements of this, but just want to appreciate all of the input that we have received. We have had more input on this than anything that we have ever done. I have committed to a methodical process. I was the one, as you heard, who said, we were putting the cart before the horse 5 years ago and didn't think that that was appropriate. I'm the one who thought that it was prudent to have multiple sessions at the committee to work through what the planning department had put forward in terms of their recommendations, and to get out in the community and do the listening sessions. That is the first time we have ever done something like that before we had any legislative proposal before us, going out and getting input and hearing from residents and weighing their concerns. We've heard you and we've heard others, and we've incorporated much of the input and concerns that we have had into the ultimate proposal that we put forward, and it's still being refined, and we're still working through it as part of this process. There was a concern that we were ramming things through and this was going to be voted on in the middle of the night with no one watching, and I think most folks who are watching this and paying attention to it see that that's not the case. Originally there was a suggestion and a misinformation that we were voting in October on a proposal that hadn't even been introduced yet. Obviously that wasn't the case. Then it was, this is going to be rammed through right after it gets introduced. Obviously that's not the case. We didn't take votes in the first session that we had because we wanted to thoughtfully go through the issues. We've got a number of follow-up items that we'll come back to in June, and we'll take it one step at a time. We're not going any faster than would be required of a methodical process, but we're not delaying it any further than would be appropriate of being thoughtful and reasonable with how we're taking up the issues. So with that, happy to open it up to questions and really appreciate you joining me on a beautiful evening that would be lovely to take a walk on instead of listening to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. So we received a number of questions from residents, but I want to open it up first to the audience. And I know we have folks online as well. If you'd like, please raise your hand. And I just ask that you just state your name and whether you live in the town or another municipality, just for the...
I'm Donald Horowitz, and I live in Section 5. And I want to talk about consolidation of properties. It'll take me a couple of minutes to get through this, if you'll forgive me. 4 to 6 weeks ago, you spoke at Section 5 meeting, and there was a lot of concern about whether a property abutting, say, Connecticut Avenue, a main thoroughfare, could be combined with another property adjacent to it, or could be combined with a property not fronting on Connecticut Avenue, but on the adjacent corner, or could be combined with a property behind the property that did abut Connecticut Avenue. And you stated really quite unequivocally that none of those would be able to be combined. Now, as it happens, I've read the report to your committee, and I've also listened to your discussion as far as consolidation goes. Just today, actually, I managed to get into it. And the opposite seems to be the case. That is to say, Chapter 50 of the county ordinance not only allows, it absolutely permits without qualification combining adjacent properties. It may, under certain circumstances, permit, and more likely does rather than doesn't permit, adding to it a property on the corner. And it doesn't allow, except under extraordinary circumstances, adding in a property behind a property that abuts, say, Connecticut Avenue or another main thoroughfare that's covered by this. This is a very important question, as everybody here can imagine, because we're talking not just about duplexes and triplexes, we're talking about apartment houses. And if you have 2 big lots, or if you have 3 big lots, you could build a pretty big apartment house, even though you can't go over 40 feet. And now, let's talk about extraordinary circumstances for just a minute, and then I will recede and wait to hear what your answer is, because you really said the opposite of every one of these propositions when you came to Section 5, and you assured the people in Section 5 and whoever else was there unequivocally that those combinations could not be made. I was there, and I'm willing to swear on a stack of Bibles that that's what you said, and I hope you are too. Let's talk about the lot behind. As it happens, I live behind one of those houses that could be for sale, and maybe 5 years from now, I'll have this exact problem. The lot behind shouldn't be combined with the property that has no connection to the main thoroughfare under ordinary circumstances. But suppose three adjacent properties are combined to build a big apartment building, or a big multiplex for that matter. And then the one on the corner can even be added to it. Now the question is, how are those cars getting in and out of Connecticut Avenue or some other main thoroughfare? And I know for a fact that this has been a concern of the planning board with respect to the fast highways. which, by the way, these days, Connecticut Avenue is, in fact, but not in law. It's a fast highway. That's basically what it is, up to the Beltway and then beyond. I can imagine a perfect scenario in which, and I think this is very common, in which a big property is built based on several small properties, and a lot of units are in that. And incidentally, the number of units contemplated is quite large to judge by the discussion of the committee and its staff. And so we can't get in and out of here. We can't have 3 driveways with cars intruding into Connecticut Avenue. There are going to be a lot of accidents, and it's going to be very inconvenient for everybody to get in and out. It's going to be inconvenient for the traffic on Connecticut Avenue. But if we get the lot behind, we can then have the parking lot there, and people can escape out the side route. And there'll just be that augmentation of traffic along the side, which will eventually flow in and out of Connecticut Avenue if necessary, or up onto Brookville Road or wherever it happens to be. So I want to hear your answer. I want to hear where you are now on consolidation of properties, especially in the light of the fact that I haven't heard a word in either the report or in the discussion at your committee about whether Chapter 50 is to be amended so that the consolidation of adjacent properties facing the thoroughfare will not be permitted, as you said it wouldn't be during that previous session.
Yeah, just to clarify, I didn't say that the adjacent lots wouldn't be permitted. I specifically and unequivocally talked about the behind lots, saying that our zoning attorneys were very clear that the zoning code does not allow that because of the through lot, which doesn't exist. That's not necessarily in the zoning code. That's in the subdivision standards, which you've referenced. And that is still the case, that there is overwhelmingly, that is not likely not allowed. There may be certain rare circumstances, and we're looking into what that might even be. And that was part of the discussion. And I did specifically talk about that. If you were to put in language, and I said I'd be open, and I still am open to language that expressly says you cannot do that you cannot have a lot that is behind that then gets brought in, because that is not the intention, was never the intention, was never part of the discussion that we had. We very specifically picked the corridor. We very specifically picked the corridors for a particular reason, because we thought that was the opportunity to do it. The challenge on that, and I have spoken about this, is that to clarify that, which already is seemingly expressly not allowed under the subdivision standards, you have to have a separate legislative mechanism. It wouldn't be done through what we've already introduced. It would be done by amending and introducing essentially an SRA, a subdivision regulation amendment, to update and change the subdivision standards. If that is something that we need to do, and ultimately there is an interest among the council to do it, that's something that is worth exploring, and that is part of the discussion and was part of the discussion in the council meeting. There are 2 other elements that have been raised. One is the adjacent lots. One of the things that I said about the adjacent lots in that meeting was that an adjacent lot, each lot is already eligible, and it would be held to the same setback requirements, lot coverage, et cetera. One of the challenges on that, and one of the questions on that, and we are taking this up, and that is part of the conversation. We are going to have to weigh these questions. It has been raised by a number of people that one of the ways that would help to address some of the concerns, like stormwater, like parking, and others, would be easier addressed if you combine lots in certain circumstances. So where it could be very difficult to address some of those concerns in a much tighter, much smaller lot, it may be easier to address those same exact issues, the very issues that have been raised and are concerned about, if you had 2 lots that were next to each other. So the question becomes, and it's a legitimate question that we need to think through, of what is the greater public policy question, and what is the concern that we more want to address? And that is something that we are taking up. We've asked for planning and council staff to work together to come up with scenarios of what combined lots could look like. What that would mean based on ordinary circumstances of what a 6,000 square foot R60 lot, with the, height and setback and other standards. And we are going to weigh that. That is part of the conversation that we're having. And we are going to decide on that in committee. The second piece that's been raised, which was not discussed at that meeting and honestly was not part of the original, main part of the discussion. It's kind of a secondary piece, is the corner lots. And what happens if you take an eligible lot that is adjacent, not behind a corner lot, and can you combine a corner lot, and then does that make that corner lot eligible? And that is part of the committee discussion that we're going to have. The same dynamic exists of whether or not a combined lot, particularly a corner combined lot, allows you to better address the stormwater, the parking, and some of the other issues, or whether we don't want to include it. And there's a put and take on that, and that's part of the active discussion that we're having, and it was raised during the committee very specifically.
I only want to add two quick sentences. I don't want to take up everybody else's time. I want to say again that you affirmed and assured the people at that meeting that adjacent properties could not be combined even if they fronted on Connecticut Avenue. And I'm prepared to get witnesses to testify to that if you like. Yeah. Secondly, the other thing.
I think what I said was I didn't think they would be.
No, you said they couldn't be. You said they couldn't be.
When I was saying that it couldn't be, and it was expressly prohibited based on our zoning attorneys, it was specifically about the behind lots that were not eligible. What I was specifically talking about, and I did say that they would be held to the same setback and lot coverage, and I went through all of those standards. And so I said, and I was, perhaps I was wrong about this, but I said, I don't know why someone would do that. You can go back and ask people who were there. There's a few people in the room who were in that room. And there are reasons perhaps that someone would want to do that you've raised.
So some of what we're discussing.
Assured. This was not something that was up for grabs. The other thing I want to say is about your most recent point about whether bigger might be better for disposing of some of the problems. This is a bit of sophistry in my view, and this is just a repeat. That is to say, well, people are complaining about congestion, they're complaining about various environmental problems. We can solve those problems by making more congestion and making the project.
I don't think that was the point I was making, but I'll concede the point.
I think it goes to the optional method of development process, right? So what I heard you say is, in other forums, was that the idea was that each lot could be developed individually. And this evening, it's also like, well, it depends on the conditions of what we're facing here. The second lot might be another alternative there. But it's all going through the optional method of development
in
process.
Order to do what is being discussed is you would have to go through subdivision first. If this is, and this is a discussion we're having at the committee, and we're going to have to decide whether or not and under what conditions, if at all, this is allowed. You'd go through subdivision first, which is a whole process through subdivision. And then after that, you would go through optional method.
So what happens if there is concern from area residents, abutting neighbors, if there is a subdivision process? Like what I think it goes to what is the level of transparency that will be available so that residents who have some concerns, whether it be about traffic, stormwater management, whatever, about the combining of two lots or more than two lots and what that could come out to, that's going to be through the subdivision process. But what level of real input will residents have to say no on that? I'm not sure if there will be.
We can follow up on the process of subdivision versus optional method, because two different.
I understand they're two different things, because optional method is just going to be simple building of the building that will contain workforce housing units or duplex in this case. But I think what it's kind of conflating, because it's unclear, because you were mentioning before, maybe it will help solve stormwater management issues, but maybe there'll be another reason And unless there's that kind of clarity for residents going in, it's unclear whether the support of combining lots is going to be there or not, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
Okay.
I will follow up on that.
All right. All right. Yes, sir. Just your name.
My name's Scott. Excuse me. My name's Scott Leachman. I live in the town here, and we've spoken before on this subject. A couple of things. I'm just going to give you two examples that would scare you. Okay. To the south of the 4-H Center are 4 homes. If you've ever walked down Connecticut Avenue, on the west side of Connecticut Avenue to the south, those 4 homes collectively are 78,000 square feet. They're each over 19,600 feet. They're identical lots. Okay. And by the way, developers go and merge lots. That's just a process they go through, and they'll willingly do it while they tie a property under contract. So people do this all the time. Okay. And it will get done. So that means they can build a 97,000 square foot building, 40-foot tall building directly to the south. Selfishly, I live on Virgilia, in between Virgilia and Underwood. Okay, there are 2 homes there on Connecticut Avenue on the west side, and they comprise about 21,000 square feet. That's a 26,000 plus square foot building that can be built on there. Okay, so he mentioned, you've used the phrase the growth corridors, and I agree. Connecticut Avenue is a major road. East-West Highway is, Old Georgetown, Wisconsin, but Connecticut you can't even really view it as that. It's a thoroughfare, and it's the busiest road in Montgomery County to get into Washington, D.C. I would say by a factor of 4, it's that busy of a road. So it's a very sensitive road. And if you look at it, since the day it was developed, it's never been anything but places of worship and residential. That's all it is. It's not a retail. There's no quality of life. So it's a very sensitive area. And I can guarantee you, if those buildings get built, what's good, the pressure it's going to put on those neighborhoods, because those people are going to want to park. They're going to spill over onto the side streets that feed into Connecticut Avenue. Okay. They're going to park in front of people's homes, and it isn't going to get pretty. So all of a sudden, these neighborhoods have been turned upside down and disrupted for nothing. It's not creating any attainable housing. There's a little bit, but it's on the margin compared to what you're doing in downtown Bethesda, which I agree with what you're doing in downtown Bethesda. And DC's done the same thing. That's a smart thing to do. That's set up to handle it. Okay. Connecticut Avenue isn't set up to do that. That's why you have all these people in Section 5 and the Chevy Chase Village and the town of Chevy Chase up in arms. Okay, because they're like, well, why are you turning these neighborhoods upside down for really nothing? You're not even getting anything out of it. Okay, so I can't speak for everybody in this room, but I think most people would say, if you just said Connecticut Avenue is off the table and East-West Highway, around the Connecticut Avenue was off the table, most of the people would turn around and leave, because they're just sitting here saying, what's the point of it all? And a developer doesn't care about the point of it. A developer just wants the right to do it. They're going to build it. They're going to sell it. They're going to go talk to private equity firms about what their return on equity was, and they're going to raise more money and do it again. And whether it disrupts a neighborhood or not, they just don't care. And I don't think personalizing it, although all the council members are well-intended, I'm sure, they don't know, they can't understand every little corridor in every neighborhood. They're not going to understand that. Going to Connecticut Avenue in the morning or the evening, it's a complete nightmare. Think about how dangerous it is to get out onto Connecticut Avenue. So what are those people going to do? They're going to go park on the side streets to look out for their own safety, which I don't blame them. But not you personally, the council unintentionally created this problem when it really didn't solve anything other than they thought, well, I'm just going to include them along with the other growth corridors. So I've told you before, it's never made any sense. Don't go anywhere near Connecticut Avenue. It's way too sensitive what's going on there. One little trip up and it's gridlock traffic. So please consider that when you're weighing all this and making your ultimate decision. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
I'll be brief. My name is Warren Nowlin, and my friend here asked me to come tonight, not knowing what was going to be discussed, specifically this. But coincidentally, I happen to live right behind one of these 4 homes on Connecticut Avenue he spoke of. I live at 6803 Meadow Lane, which backs up to to the houses on Connecticut Avenue. And undoubtedly, those houses will be redeveloped, and my backyard will look out onto some big high apartment building. My point here is quite different. Statistically, if you look at the impact in terms of providing affordable housing, which it won't be, or any kind of marginal housing, this is infinitesimal, this corridor that we're talking about. But you turn people's lives upside down for something that's not going to achieve the underlying purpose. That's not good government, okay? And I would simply say this. So when you ran the first time for council, I supported you. I came to a neighborhood meeting hosted by one of my neighbors, and I supported you. Like everybody else, if this crazy, ridiculous legislation goes through and people like you support it, I guarantee you there will be overwhelming support in the other direction for anybody that votes for legislation that makes no sense. And most importantly, I think that this is more about social engineering than it is about housing. So, and this is really important. Everybody in my neighborhood bought their homes because it is what it is, or was what it was. A single family neighborhood, a safe neighborhood. And now the state and the county are trying to re-engineer the communities that we live in and change the paradigm that all of us saved very hard to purchase our homes, and change that. And you're changing the game on us when it makes really no sense other than social engineering to achieve some effect that politically you guys want, but the people who live in the communities don't want overwhelmingly. And that to me is bad government. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Oops, yes.
Pardon me if I sit down, I'll fall over if I stand. This issue seems to have been repackaged from previous issues. Originally, it was affordable housing. Now it's workforce. The workforce issue, I think, the arguments raised for it, for example, the need to diversify the workforce, the need to bring new leaders into the county. I just don't buy these. What is the next level going to be when these arguments fall apart? Bringing new leaders. My discussion leader at Chevy Chase Elementary Library lived in Chevy Chase Lake. She was driven out of her affordable housing with all the tear downs of the county. This was county property, I believe. So just from personal experiences, I think you've got it all wrong. What we need to do, if it's the workforce, the real issue, we need to get the education system up and running better. Yes, we got a relatively new high school in Wheaton. But the people coming in from different countries, I was at 4.5 months in a nursing home during COVID to be with my wife who had Alzheimer's. The staff were all from Nigeria. They had no idea of how the financial structure of this area or county works. I see our high school kids, they really have no idea of how the financial system works. I came here with $250 and a bag of 50 silver dollars 70 years ago. I learned the system. I've been successful. I live in Chevy Chase. I originally looked in Lux Manor, and the real estate agent said to me, "Oh, with your income, you should live in Silver Spring." So I went halfway. I bought a house in Chevy Chase. But I really think we're doing it if the workforce is a valid issue, we're going about it all wrong. Montgomery County is noted, the education department is noted for its ability to get federal grants. But the minute the grant runs out, they cancel the class. They've been doing this for 40 years, back when I was managing school board elections in Montgomery County. So look at if diversity, or not really diverse, if the workforce issues are important, you're going about it from the wrong direction. Get the education department in tune with those issues.
Appreciate it. First of all, I'm glad you're here and you made the decision to come to Chevy Chase 70 years ago. I just wanted, first of all, and I agree with you on the, first and foremost, education and getting those issues sorted out. I have worked very hard on those issues. We'll continue to work hard on that. When I was council president, we passed for the first time accountability and reporting language in the budget resolution, which we've never done before, to actually tie the funding that we provide the school system with actual expectations for outcomes, which I think we need to be doing a lot more of and haven't done enough of. The crown jewel of the county, what has attracted people here, has been our public school system, and that is a challenge right now. And the outcomes are not what they used to be, and they're not what they ought to be. And we have some real work to do in that regard. And I agree with you on the financial literacy piece of young people. This is not just an issue in Montgomery County. I worked on this issue statewide of trying to have a requirement of financial education and financial literacy for all young people. It's one of the foundational critical things for every person to enter the workforce, to have those building blocks. But, ultimately, there's a lot of pushback on requirements of school systems and the school board, including ours here. In terms of the point that you made, which I appreciate, this feels like it's just repackaged. I just will clarify, because I think it's important. This is dramatically different than what was recommended and proposed by the planning board. They suggested allowing everything within what we're talking about here, within this realm, by right. We are requiring a significant process that I've gotten pushback on, where people who want to see us go further and do more have said, I am the obstacle, and have held that up. I think there are very good reasons for why we are doing that, but that was in response to the concerns that were addressed. Their original proposal would have allowed for much more. It would not have had the restrictions and the standards that we have set up with 40-foot requirements and some of the other setback and other standards that we have put in place to create safeguards to address some of the concerns that folks have raised. The original proposal went well into the neighborhoods. Now we're talking about under what circumstances could someone go through to add on a one-off basis an additional lot, if that is possible. the original proposal would have had thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of more lots that would have been impacted. We're talking in this case about the corridors and trying to work through some of these nuanced issues, which are legitimate issues, but nuanced issues in the ballpark and magnitude of about just over 1% of the residential lots in Montgomery County, 1.18%. That's what is on the table and what we're talking about. So I think it's important. There's plenty of room for concern and disagreement and questions and discussion and debate. But it is not, I don't think, accurate to say that this is a repackaged version of what was previously put forward, because it is dramatically different from what has been put forward. It doesn't mean you like it. It doesn't mean you agree with it. It doesn't mean that you think that it's the right approach. I think that's all fair game, but it is significantly different from what was put forward.
I'm reading some questions coming in from the chat. Sorry, just need to see it again. Oh no. Okay. Under optional method of development, why would the residents believe that the planning board would care what residents think?
I've heard that concern before. I do think if you look at the way that optional method works, even though the planning board and the planning department is supportive of certain projects, you will see in large multifamily buildings where you see going through optional methods, significant changes and concessions made during those processes. It doesn't mean that residents have a veto and are allowed to stop projects on a regular basis. That's not what the intention of that process is, but issues that come up are addressed, and there is a public process. It's not dissimilar to going to school and having to show your work in a public way. It's one thing to turn in your assignment privately with, nobody's there to see it. And it's another thing to have to do it in front of the public. And that process, that public process, is significant and I think is important and is the foundation of every aspect of the review that we have. So I do think it is meaningful and I do think it is important. And I think the pushback on that, the other option, besides doing nothing, which I understand some would prefer, but the other option of that is to go by right. And by right means you're going to get a sign in a yard that comes up, and then you're going to have somebody pull a permit with the Department of Permitting Services, and it's going to happen, and you're going to have no input in it whatsoever. There's going to be no public discussion, no avenue to address it in any way. So I think the optional method is very significant. It is a major concession. And in fact, as I mentioned, there are many people who wanted to see us go further who are very upset about it because it makes some of these projects less likely to actually happen, and it makes the process longer and more expensive. But I think that the benefits outweigh the costs and the time.
One more question coming in from chat. What is the labor forecast in Montgomery County, particularly in Chevy Chase, given the large scale terminations of employment in the federal government and the budget constraints for future employment? Also says, I commend Councilmember Friedson for seeking local input.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I commend you and everybody here for being part of the local decision-making process. I always say that even when people are upset with me or with the council or with the county, that everybody should be this engaged and this passionate about local issues. I wish we had more of it, to be honest with you. And so I really do appreciate that and should start and end with that. In terms of the local forecast, obviously there are a lot of open questions of what the latest federal decisions are going to have on our local and regional economy. There are court cases on questioning, the treatment of probationary employees. Some of the decisions I find outrageous and draconian by their nature. Exactly where that ends up, it's unclear. At this point, we don't have, exact understanding of, the labor force and the workforce and what the impacts are going to be. Having said that, there aren't credible analysts who I have heard from who have predicted that the housing challenges that we face are going to go away, that there is going to be no demand for people to want to live here. And if that were the case, two things. One, that would be an even bigger crisis than anything that we're talking about here. If there is literally no demand for people who want to live in Montgomery County, in Chevy Chase, in Bethesda, that would be an existential crisis, a personal crisis for each and every one of us, in our homes and where we live, and a, broader crisis for the county, because that demand is what we base everything off of. That's what our property tax revenue and income tax receipts and everything is based on, that fund all of our services. I will also say that nobody is required to do anything here. So if there is no interest in people living in Montgomery County, if there are more people who have homes than people who desire to live in the homes that we have, there won't be new housing that is built. There won't be people moving into that new housing. It's predicated on there being a demand for it. It is not a eminent domain situation. The government isn't taking over anybody's property. The choice of a property owner still remains of whether or not they want to sell their property and what happens when somebody purchases that property. It's the same reason why today everybody could tear down their house and build it to the setback and height and lot requirements. Most people don't do that for a lot of reasons. They like their house. They're comfortable in their house. There's too much disruption to do that. There are many reasons why that doesn't happen. All of this is based on the demand. And if the demand isn't there, then you're not going to see a change occurred, even if it is legally allowed.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Steve Seidel from the town of Chevy Chase. And first I want to thank you. This proposal has come a very long way from what the planning board started out with, or where they ended up. And I think you've addressed many of the concerns, but I think the lot consolidation still is a problem. But what I want to really address here is, I think you've created an incentive in the way you've structured it by requiring the additional workforce housing unit for 3 or more units, that you've created an incentive to build 2 units, and I think there's a way you could address that by maybe having some sort of apportioned fee, even on duplexes, and that would take away the incentive to build 2 units over 3 units.
I appreciate that. This was part of the discussion, and it's a totally valid and reasonable point. One of the suggestions as part of the discussion and deliberation was to allow duplexes by right, because they are held to the same standards as a single family home, just with an additional door and additional family potentially in it, although there could be multiple families that live in what we call a single family home, and that does exist in many parts of the county today, or whether everything would be required to go through the optional method of development, even though it is a pretty significant standard for a duplex to go through. Ultimately, I decided that it was much clearer, much better for us to have everything go through the same process. So what is built in is that the marginal benefit that you would get from a duplex and the cost of going through optional method development when you could tear down the house and build a much bigger, more valuable house is where some of that cost comes in. So I hear what you're saying. The economics of it don't quite shake out exactly as I think people think of. The cost of a duplex is actually somewhat expensive when you compare it to a regular house, because you need 2 hookups, you need 2 kitchens. Some of the most expensive aspects of building a single family house, you have to do twice. And so there are some built-in dynamics that actually make that less attractive, from a financial standpoint in terms of what the benefit might be. Having said that, this is an ongoing question of how do you treat the duplex? Do you make it easier? Do you make it by right as opposed to optional method? We decided not to do that. I don't have no interest in changing that, but that's really where we addressed that particular issue in terms of the incentive, disincentive, and the financial barrier to the, various options that somebody might have.
So the developers will pay impact taxes on all of these developments. Is that right?
If you're adding a unit, you pay an impact tax on the additional unit. So if you replace a single family home with another single family home, you're not adding a unit, so you don't pay impact taxes. If you're replacing a single family home with 2 units or 3 units or 4 units, you pay the impact on the additional units is how the process works.
What is your position on Councilmember Mink's $20,000 demolition tax, which basically the intent, as I understand it, is to then raise funds for affordable housing?
Yeah, well, it's trying to sweeten the pot it's to raise funds for my project and program that I champion, the Housing Production Fund, which is a national model for affordable housing projects. I have concerns about the proposal. It's similar, but a different approach to what Evan Glass had proposed previously, which was to charge impact tax for teardowns. Also, the challenge there was twofold. One, you're not adding a unit. So, even in a multifamily apartment, if you're taking a garden apartment that has 20 units, tearing it down, infill, and replacing with a 100-unit building, you don't pay impact taxes on 100 units. You pay impact taxes on the marginal change between the units that were there and the new units. So if you're, by definition, replacing one single family home with a bigger single family home, it's still one unit. It's just a bigger unit. That's number one. Number two, the challenge with it is I asked for the data on the student generation rates of teardowns. And actually, I was not surprised. The student generation rates of a teardown, much larger, newer custom home, is lower than someone moving into an existing house, which makes sense. A young family that has young school-aged children is more likely to be buying an older existing home than they are tearing down a home and building a much bigger home based on where they are at that point. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It's just that the literal data is smaller, or they are wealthy enough and have choices, and some of them send their kids to private school for many reasons. But the student generation, like literally the data doesn't support that. And then the last piece is, if the goal is revenue, teardowns are very positive revenue for the county. There's many reasons why people don't like teardowns in their community. They like the charm of older units. They like all kinds of things about it. And I totally understand that. But if your exclusive lens that you are looking this through is how much money is being generated for the county, tearing down a building type that is not the highest and most expensive valued property on a by value property tax, the revenue impact is much more significant, not to mention recordation tax and others. On Councilmember Mink's proposal, we just dramatically raised recordation taxes, which targeted specifically the most expensive homes that we have in the county, many of which are the very homes that we're talking about here, the large custom homes that are maximum size, that are at the most expensive types that we have. So we're already generating more money specifically targeted to these, and a $20,000 increase, to make housing more expensive, to try to make housing more affordable, it just doesn't seem like the right approach to me. So I'm not a big fan of the approach. I actually didn't vote for the recordation tax increase that was done. I had a different approach. I thought it should be, instead of starting at 600,000 with the increases, I thought it should start at $1 million. I thought it was a much more reasonable number to pay a premium over $1 million. And I also thought all of the increase should go exclusively to schools, to school construction. What ultimately happened is the premium goes to everything. It goes to county government buildings and other things, all of which, there's reasons to like those too. But my thought process was, if we're going to raise taxes on folks, I think we could make the case, if it's to build schools, that they could go along with that. I think it's a harder case. It goes to everything. That seems not focused enough from my perspective.
So we're talking about metrics. What does success mean to you in 2050 if this goes through?
Well, we're never going to have 2,500 units being torn down and built. I mean, I think that if that is the standard of the metric, that is not going to be a benefit. The idea here is to give options and choices. And the goal would be that you see the benefit of more people coming in and benefiting from living in our community, and some of the biggest concerns that people have being mitigated and not being as significant as they are, and the process working. I think, we heard concerns before of people just not believing that the optional method process or the public input is not going to work, that we're going to have, greater challenges and issues than we had. My goal is to do it. But there's not one single housing solution or proposal that's going to solve every issue. The question is this something that should be part of the mix that should and can help to address some of the challenge? There's reasonable minds can disagree on that. I think that's fair game. But ultimately, the goal is to, have a number of different options that people can take advantage of.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Yvette Dominguez. I do live in the town. We have kind of roughly run the numbers as to what this would mean to us, and it's certainly a lot more than 1%. In fact, it looks like we would have an increase of 26% in the number of units that would be in this community. My question to you, and I have a few, is how much does this town need to bear for it to be fair? Why would we be bearing more than our fair share in this community over other communities? That's one. The second question is parking. Parking is very delicate in this community. And I would offer to walk you through all of the streets that we have that today are one way, or you can only park on one side of the street, that if it rains or snow, it's prohibited from parking. The parking situation is really, really difficult. And so we know that it has been made very easy for the developers to not offer two parking units per unit. And we're wondering, why are you guys making it easy for the developers to build instead of for the people that live here to live with this increase in the community? So I'll stop there, but I have more questions, but I think those are good to start with.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to go through and see the 26% of additional units. I'm not sure I, trust you. That seems like a high number, but I perhaps I have a slightly different view. I think that the idea that new housing exclusively is a burden and there's no benefit from that is not something that I fully agree with. And I hear where you're coming from, and I understand and appreciate the concerns about parking and stormwater and other dynamics. They're totally legitimate. But I do think there is a benefit to having new neighbors, to having more housing, to having, additional opportunities for more people to live in the community. We have to do it in a thoughtful way. We have to do it in a reasonable and a rational way. I think we have tried to thread the needle here, however imperfectly. We have done that. There have been a number of compromises here. I go to, housing advocate meetings, and they beat me up for, conceding too much and listening to, the folks who are opposed and watering down the recommendations that came from the planning department. I come here and I'm told that, and doing what we're, suggesting doing here is extreme and outrageous and should never happen. Again, that's why we're here. That's why I'm listening. That's why we're trying to address these issues. We had, one of the changes that I didn't mention earlier, there's a number, but one of them is parking. The planning department in their recommendations suggested significant reductions in parking to make these projects cheaper and easier to do. We did not adopt those and did not take those issues. So, that is one of the changes and one of the differences. I heard many of the concerns within the neighborhoods. One of the reasons why we're only focusing on the corridors is that I understand that doesn't eliminate all of the concerns and questions that you have because of spillover and other things that were mentioned earlier, which I get, and we're thinking through and trying to address. I think the optional method addresses some of that, much of that, but obviously nothing is perfect. But that is one of the reasons why we dramatically targeted and focused on it, because we didn't have great answers from my perspective on exactly how we're going to address each and every one of those concerns and issues. So we have responded to many of the concerns that you have raised. But I do think that, this is not a proposal that is only focused on Chevy Chase. In fact, the original proposal just focused on metros and, Purple Line stations would have overwhelmingly only focused on, certain areas around transit, within proximity to transit, which would have been much more limited in area, but significant in terms of the number of properties that were impacted. Ours here affects fewer numbers of properties, is countywide, is more focused and aligned with our county priority, which is a corridor-focused approach to growth, which has long been, even before Thrive, has been the focus of the county's growth pattern. And we've tried to address the issues, including the ones that you've raised. Again, I understand it's not exactly as some would prefer, but we have tried to address those issues, and I understand the point that you're making.
So we have 20 minutes left. Do you have a quick
No, I think
question?
there's other questions.
Okay, I'm going to go over here. Sorry, Deedon went first. Go ahead,
Okay.
Deedon.
I just have a couple of comments and a suggestion. One comment is I'm a little concerned about the optional method really being optional. Listening to the planning board talk about it, they were not particularly supportive of having it come through as optional method. They thought it would just be too burdensome on the planning staff and the planning committee planning board to have to look at all of these things. And I really wonder how much time and effort and consideration they will give to neighbors' comments and resident comments. That's just a comment. One suggestion for the consolidation issue is, I believe, with the attainable housing proposals that came through before this, that there was a limit of 2 lots being combined, or a total of 12,000 square feet. And one thing you might consider doing is limiting development, that put a cap on the FAR, that can, the actual square footage that can be built, as opposed to worrying so much about how many lots you're allowing to combine. You could put a limit of 1.25 on a 12,000, assume the cap would be 1.25 FAR on a 12,000 square foot lot. So whatever that works out to be, 15,000 square feet, I think, just put a limit. Doesn't matter how many square feet the lot is, that's your cap. And that would take care of a lot of the size issues that you could see happening.
I really appreciate that. We are working through what the options would be, looking at a combination of 2 lots combining and 3 lots combining, and looking through different scenarios, and R60 and R90 lots, just so everybody knows, since not everybody here is probably a zoning expert. An R60 lot is probably most of the lots in this community. That's generally a 6,000 square foot lot. An R90 is generally a 9,000 square foot lot. We tend to see those in some of the outer Chevy Chase communities. The closer in Chevy Chase communities tend to be R60 lots. They're then larger lots than that are part of this R200, which would be a 20,000 square foot lot, for instance. But we're going to work through and weigh those issues and decide that. But we do have some options of thinking through how to address it. Like I said, the behind lot question is more the subdivision dynamic in terms of the through lot prohibition. The adjacent lot, there could be options, including some of the things that you have put forward, that we're going to have to weigh and think through and decide what makes the most sense. So I appreciate the suggestion.
Yeah. I'm Barney Rush, and on the town council here in the town of Chevy Chase. Thank you very much for coming here, council member.
Old enough to remember when this started and you were the mayor.
That's true. Even before then. One of the issues that we on the council had discussed, and which was put into the letter that you referred to, was looking for confirmation that the compatibility requirements would be attached to any ZTA in this regard. And for the audience, its compatibility requirements are in the current code, and are basically designed to grapple with exactly the situation as described at the outset of the meeting, with homes that were right next to larger scale development, and specify both a sort of 45-degree angle at which development is undertaken and also the setback. And we were looking to see if those compatibility requirements could be basically reconfirmed in the context of the CTA. I'd be interested in where that proposal stands and what your thoughts are about it.
Yeah, we're still getting some analysis to better understand how that would work in practice. One of the challenges, those compatibility standards, at least at my initial response that I have received from zoning attorneys on the council staff, are based on a single family home that's, 30 to 35 feet and a large building, that's 80, 90, 100 feet, a much taller, maybe even 70 feet, but a much taller building. It's much more difficult, for instance, like a 45-degree setback standard, when you're talking about a building that's 5 feet taller than the maximum building of the single family home. Right. So if you just think about the ability to get a 45-degree angle, if it's like this, much easier and a much more opportunity than if it's like that. So those standards are based on much taller buildings, and so the opportunity to do that is much clearer. That's what those standards are there for. Figuring out how that would work, where there's a gap of 5 feet in terms of the two different building types on the corridor versus behind the corridor, is a little bit more challenging. But I'm looking into that further and better understanding what that would be, and we're gonna we'll address it as we move forward.
Thank you for doing that. Just very quickly, there's also the setbacks, and it's also where you take the measurement of the 45 degrees. So it's not just. I think the implication of your comment was 5 feet shouldn't be. Well, 8 feet. In our town, it wouldn't make any difference at the end of the day. But I'm not saying
it wouldn't make any difference. I'm just saying it is different. Okay. Not that it wouldn't make any difference. Yeah. So the way that we address setbacks, a little bit differently than what is suggested, but significant. And in fact, I think could be more restrictive in some cases. And I need to go through, and we're getting some analysis on this so I can better understand it. If you're building a duplex, you're held to the same standards as a single family home in terms of lot coverage, setbacks, et cetera, rear side, et cetera. And if you're building more than that, then you're held to the same standard as the lowest intensity, lowest density townhouse requirements, but with a 40-foot cap. Whereas I mentioned earlier, some townhome allow for 45 feet. So that's where we addressed it. And in those contexts, that's single family home to single family home setbacks, and townhome sometimes up to 45 feet to single family home setback. So in that sense, I think that the setback is probably appropriate in the sense that we have, addressed it in that way and restricted it. Again, much more restrictive than what was originally suggested and proposed in that sense. But again, we're going to get some more analysis on this to better understand and compare. It was an interesting point that was raised. That is something for us to think about. But there is a difference between talking about a larger building and the setback and angled requirements. Similarly, like there are certain zones where there's 2-for-1, where you go 2 to 1, 2 to 1, but there's not an opportunity to do that here either, because of the size difference. But I appreciate it, and we're looking into it.
We're getting a couple more questions off the chat, which I'm going to paraphrase. Is there any discussion about capping the price for these workforce housing units?
Yes,
so that it's
that's
truly
by definition, that's what the workforce housing requirement does. Essentially the workforce housing, like MPDU, the MPDU is a moderately priced dwelling units. MPDU standards, depending on the type of unit, is between 60 and 70% of area median income. Workforce housing is between 70 and 120% of area median income. 120% of area median income currently for a couple in Montgomery County is affordability at $148,000 for a couple. So that's two people who make right around $75,000 a year. So those are two teachers, firefighters, police officers, et cetera. So literally by definition, that's what the workforce housing standard and requirement does. It restricts those units to that level of affordability where someone wouldn't be cost burdened, from a formula, and would be able to afford their rent or the purchase price. Similarly to how the MPDU program works and other, programs will work, but it is a restricted unit. That is the point.
Okay. Will historic properties be also included, those that either define National Historic or the state?
Yeah, this is an override historic designation. So if there are a historic designation, those standards and those restrictions would remain in place. That was discussed in committee, was part of the committee discussion, and is in the packet that's publicly available from that committee discussion that we had a couple weeks ago.
I have a question. I'm Ellen Cornelius Erickson. I live in the town of Chevy Chase. So I'm just wondering about maybe not Connecticut Avenue here in the town, but as it goes up, will this workforce housing be part of Kensington and Northern Connecticut Avenue as well?
Yeah, the workforce housing requirement is a requirement everywhere.
Okay, so if a developer is going to buy up Connecticut Avenue, how are you going to avoid them gentrifying the pieces of property? And I mean, if they buy and they turn some of the property into workforce housing, and then they just make it so expensive because they make this really nice piece of property in downtown Kensington, which is beautiful. I assume that's an unintended consequence of what you're thinking. How are you going to prevent that?
I understand the question. So,
because I've lived in
our
DC and this
inclusionary
happened.
zoning program is predicated on the idea that it's not a benefit to the developer or cost to the developer. It is a cost in the sense that it changes the pro forma, math of what works and what doesn't work and what you can build and what you can't build based on what the market will bear, what somebody will pay for housing. But generally, it's predicated on the idea that the other units subsidize that unit. That in order to make it work, you are paying more for 85% of the units, pay a little bit more for 15% of the units to pay a little bit less.
Right, but
that's essentially what the standard is based on. And that's the same as the MPDU program. That's the same as any inclusionary zoning, which we invented in Montgomery County, has become the model of, inclusionary zoning programs around the country. It does make housing more expensive. I think that we have to acknowledge that for those other units, but it allows for a level of mixed income communities, which has been the standard in Montgomery County since the 1970s.
So I would encourage you to flip your mindset and think like you're a developer, because you are essentially becoming a developer and you're becoming part of this. And so
I'm not sure what that means.
Well, I mean, I used to live in DC and the same thing happened and the neighborhood turned over and the developers in the city made a lot of money, and there were the affordable housing programs and people couldn't afford to live there anymore. And there were these calculations. And so there was a subset of affordable housing, but the other part of the building became so expensive to pay for that subset of affordable housing. The people in the neighborhood couldn't live in the neighborhood anymore. So I see that you're coming from this, I don't know what the word was you used a minute ago, but I would just encourage you to flip it around and make sure that you're doing the other side of the equation and seeing what could happen.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you what will happen if we don't add supply to housing is that housing will become unaffordable for most people to afford. So that is the status quo dynamic is a problem. I think we have to acknowledge that. What the solution should be, I think we can have debates on, what's the best approach to this issue, but that is overwhelmingly pricing people out of the market. There is really good data to show this question of gentrification and disinvestment versus displacement in Montgomery County, which I would encourage you. I'm happy to share it with you, Ellen. I'm happy to share it with others. It's not to say that displacement isn't an issue anywhere. It's not to say that it isn't an issue at times in Montgomery County, but overwhelmingly, the issue that we have in Montgomery County is not displacement. Overwhelmingly, it is disinvestment. That is what has created concentrations of poverty. That is what has created some of the divides that we have in the county of East and West. It is large swaths of the county that have been overwhelmingly and chronically disinvested over time that have made them less desirable. And the people of means and who have choices leave or choose not to stay. And those who have no choices are left to remain in what oftentimes can be neighborhoods that are disinvested and therefore deteriorate. So there are other parts of the region, if you look at, that actually the gentrification numbers are clear in DC, even in Northern Virginia, where we see that. The same is not the case in Montgomery County. And if you look at some of the planning and zoning decisions that we've made, they're largely predicated on that concept. And there's a lot of data to support it. To say, for instance, the East dynamic, this didn't happen by chance, it happened by choice. We made a decision to remove the 95 corridor out of our growth strategy. And as a result, the East County was disinvested chronically over time. And that has created many of the challenges that we face. If you actually look at the covenant restrictions, we had covenant restrictions in the eastern part of the county in many of those neighborhoods, like we had, unfortunately, here in Chevy Chase, in like the Silver Spring area. We have really good reports that we have received in terms of covenants of some of those neighborhoods. The story and the history is not particularly good in large portions of inside the Beltway, older neighborhood, subdivision Montgomery County. So I hear what you're saying generally, but I think it's important that we really focus on the issue. Silver Spring is a really good example. We upzoned Silver Spring. As a result, we received more low-income residents, more middle-income residents, and more high-income residents. All of those numbers increased by the increase. Again, Silver Spring downtown is a different animal and dynamic of what we're talking about here. And the last thing I think is important related to that issue, because it's come up a lot, so I'm glad that you raised it. These are single family homeowner properties. So the person who owns that home is not being gentrified. The only time that someone would be, potentially displaced would be if they're an existing renter in one of these units and intend to stay a renter in that unit in perpetuity or for an extended period of time. And the reality is they're likely already going to be gentrified if they're at that level of risk because of a lack of supply and the way that the housing market is going, because housing costs are just going up. If the benefit is to tear down that house and build a much more lucrative, expensive house, or to rent it for inexpensive, or to do something else, like eventually the market is going to dictate for that person who's renting it out to do something else. For the 80% of people who live in those homes, they will either stay in their home or they will benefit directly and build wealth based on the option to do it. So it's a little bit different than the gentrification issue of a lower density rental unit that gets torn down and a higher density and higher quality, so to speak, newer, nicer, more luxury type of unit gets replaced in its stead.
The other part is our assessments have gone up dramatically.
Yes, they have.
In the last however many years. And that's another form of, kind of being priced out of your own home.
I'm glad you raised that. That's why I have very publicly and very emphatically come out against the proposed property tax increase. I opposed it 2 years ago when colleagues approved the property tax increase. In fact, I was the only person who opposed the property tax increase because I thought it was too high. 4 people voted against it, but 3 voted against it because it wasn't high enough, and everybody else supported it because it was lower than what the county executive wanted originally, which was a 10% increase. The reality is we're generating a ton of additional resources for the county based on rising property assessments, not to mention income taxes that have come in actually above what we're projected. I think those are going to be lower than what we're expecting in the out years, unfortunately. But the property tax assessments have gone way up, and we ought to be able to make do with what we have. And we can add significant additional funding for schools, for instance, within the amount of money that we're generating just from property tax assessments that we have. I also tried to do a senior property tax credit last year. That ran into some hurdles among colleagues who didn't like it based on racial equity concerns and also based on operational implementation concerns, although I will note that it was targeted for the first time to people who actually needed it, to those making under 90,000. We regrouped, and I worked with colleagues, and we just approved a new iteration of that, not exclusively a senior property tax credit, but an expansion of a existing state property tax credit that we're able to do called the homeowners tax credit, the HOTC. And that allows for anybody making up to $75,000 who owns a home to get a significantly higher tax break on their property tax bill, so that folks aren't run out of their homes based on exactly what you're talking about, where we're basically putting at risk homeowners who are living on fixed incomes, which I think is going to be a significant issue. And so, very happy that finally made through. It took about a year and a half to get done. Such is the legislative process. I guess it's better than 7 years, although I didn't really start on this journey personally 7 years ago. But we were able to do that. So I'm working hard to address that. I do think that is a real serious issue for many in our community. Certainly for some, they can absorb it and deal with it, but for many, they can't. And we need to address that in a serious way. And then there's also, beyond the property tax increases, there are huge fee increases. I mean, massive fee increases that are proposed in this budget that are somewhat unfathomable in terms of their increase. Those will impact renters because they address multifamily. They'll impact condos, which are some of our most important home ownership opportunities for those who can afford lower cost homes. And those are the most significant increases, but they also impact every homeowner in the community with significant fees, which we're also trying to push back on and address. So, there are some major issues related to that outside of this particular topic, which is out here tonight. So I will stop there, but I appreciate it being raised.
We have time for one last question.
All right, sure. Hi, Mr. Friedson. I'm also a resident, obviously, of Town of Chevy Chase. Met you with a different hat on a few weeks ago. Just trying to come back to parking and traffic. I'm trying to think if there's anything I can add here. Sort of piggybacking a little bit on what one of the gentlemen behind me was getting at. It seems to me that when it comes to the road segment of Connecticut from east-west down to Bradley, you got 2 intersections, and you've got that road segment, and you've got the traffic concern, and you've got the parking concern of it spilling into the neighborhoods. I think you said there's about 2,500 lots out of 180,000 or something like that.
Yeah, 2,470.
What is it?
2,470.
2,470. Okay. So
you got it.
It seems to me, the one practical question is, do we want to have the fight, we being both residents of the town and of the government, do you want to have the fight over parking and traffic now or later. In other words, if we pass it as is, then when you have these going through the optional method, and you're going to have basically case by case arguments, someone's going to come in and say, here's what I want to do on these properties. And then you're going to have the local residents rise up and say, no, parking and traffic. And then you can have it out then, or we could potentially sort of have it out now. And where I suppose the win for a certain significant portion of the town would be for the government to recognize that certain road segments and certain intersections are more significant or more ripe for impact than others. And maybe this is the time, rather than expending all the energy on both sides, having that fight later, we pull out the scalpel now and we say, this road segment, this intersection here and a few other places, there's no point in zoning it because we can recognize, we can be objective, and we can say that the parking and the traffic just won't work. And so instead of 2,470 lots, maybe the number needs to be, I'm making this up, 2,250 lots, where we take, 7 segments and half a dozen or a dozen intersections, including, in our case, Connecticut and East, West, and Bradley, and say, okay, we already know in advance the numbers aren't going to work. Let's just save ourselves the time, not have the fight there, and focus on the other 2,400 lots and not fight over the 70 that's going to be time consumptive and counterproductive. So I don't know. That's the only thing I could think of to throw at you here at the 11th hour.
I hear you. I will just tell you, I'm a straight shooter to the extent that I can be and try to be. And I think you'd be more likely to have nothing approved than to have something approved that carved out Chevy Chase or carved out, one, particular area of the county. I just, realistically, I think that would be a very difficult thing for 11 council members, or a majority of 11 council members, to agree on, and to say, this part of the county or this segment of roadway is going to be excluded. I mean, I understand what you're saying and I hear you on that. I just being totally, honest, about the request. I think there would be major pushback. And I think there are a lot of dynamics. I mean, let's be honest, of a suggestion that Chevy Chase is not included in the proposal. The reason why this segment is included is based on the standards that have been set, which are not picking and choosing one neighborhood or one community. It's the 100-foot of master planned right of way. It's the 3 existing travel lanes. If there was going to be a change, I think there would have to be, some type of standardized approach that looked at changing what that approach would be of what is eligible. But I don't think you're going to get agreement likely on cutting out a stretch of Connecticut Avenue, or cutting out, the Chevy Chases, or cutting out some segment in a particular part of the county. I get what
you're saying. To be clear, I wouldn't say the language shouldn't necessarily say we hereby carve out Chevy Chase. What I would say is, you take a numerical quantitative analysis process and say, we're not going to do this on roads or intersections where level of service or traffic or parking, some metric, whatever, is already so bad that it's obvious that any addition will be done. And then you just apply that across the system. And, if that eliminates 27 road segments, or 17 road segments, or 100 road segments, or 2 road segments, whatever.
Got it.
The point is, you take an objective, fair approach. I'm just saying that being local here, we know that such an approach would likely exclude the particular segment we're concerned about. But it's not to say it should be to the exclusion of excluding other segments that would also fail the quantitative analysis, testing for traffic and level of service. I'm sorry, parking.
Got it. Okay. I appreciate that.
This takes 1 second. If you find out later that the distance of Connecticut Avenue is less than 100 feet, okay? Would you tell us right now, then it's a no-go because it doesn't meet that 100-foot minimum?
So because of the issues with how you measure, and that the standard is the master planned right of way. So there has been a question of whether or not that could be changed to the actual right of way. I think it'd be hard to do that, but it is something that is worth, us thinking about and looking at.
That's always been a magic number. If you found out it's 95 feet, does that mean that stretch of Connecticut Avenue can't be developed because it doesn't meet the 100-foot threshold.
Yeah, I tried to just answer that. It's based on the master plan right-of-way at 100 feet. So it's not based on measuring tape of what is there, and roadways can get narrower or wider in certain areas based on, certain areas. It's what is the master planned right-of-way, and what is on the map of the parcels that are included are based on what the master plan right-of-way is.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your willingness to stay over and ask your questions. Please, I would imagine if there's any other questions or comments that you want to make, Councilmember Friedson's always available via email, of course, and there'll be other meetings as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.